Hello, and welcome to this Brit Lit 10 video podcast on the Canterbury Tales. This is Lesson 3, the language of the Canterbury Tales. Before we begin, I ask that you give the material the time and the attention that it deserves. I reserve the right to give you a pop quiz on any homework assignment, including this video podcast. You may also be held responsible for this material on high-value assessments such as projects, essays, tests, and the semester exam. Please resist the temptation to multitask and close all of the programs on your computer except those that you might use for note-taking. As you watch and listen, take notes, stopping and replaying the video as necessary. Be prepared to apply what you've learned in this video to your understanding of the poem. Let's begin. You may recall from the previous video podcast that Geoffrey Chaucer, who wrote the Canterbury Tales, is often cited as the father of English poetry. If this is true, and again, who am I to say that it's not, we can explain his position of prominence by looking not only at the poetry that he wrote, but also by taking a few minutes to consider the language that he wrote it in. Chaucer lived in the second half of the 14th century, toward the end of what we now call the Middle Ages. As you know from the previous video podcast, it was a time of tremendous social, political, and economic change. Feudalism had come and gone, cities grew large, a new merchant class was on the rise, there were plagues and holy wars, and the church grew stronger and more corrupt, even as it was challenged by secular institutions such as universities. But it was also a time of tremendous linguistic change. Things like dictionaries didn't exist, and while British culture was by this time a written culture, unlike back in the Anglo Saxon days, the only people who could read or write were members of either the aristocracy or the clergy. Consequently, in the 350 years of the Middle Ages, the English language changed rapidly, and the most important of these changes came from the bottom up. That is to say, they came from the peasantry. Living at the end of the Middle Ages, Chaucer wrote in a language that is now known as Middle English. Middle English is the immediate precursor to modern English, the language that we speak today. It comes into being in the 12th century, as the Normans and the Anglo Saxons interact in the wake of the Norman conquest. So let's look at the emergence of this language called Middle English. The best metaphor that I can think of is that Middle English is the product of a marriage between Anglo Saxon and the version of French spoken by the invaders from Normandy. Now you will recall that the Anglo Saxon period in Britain ends with the Norman conquest in 1066. You will also recall that it was William's goal not to eliminate the Anglo-Saxons, but to conquer and rule over them. Remember, he was spurred to action because he believed that he was the rightful king of England, even if he came from someplace else. So in the wake of the Norman conquest, there were a lot of single Anglo-Saxon women and a lot of eligible French-Norman men. Why? Easy. The women were war widows, and the men were soldiers in the conquering army. In an agricultural age where a cohesive family unit was not just preferable but critical to survival, you can pretty much see where this is all going. Anglo-Saxon women would routinely marry French-Norman men. In such households, and there were a lot of them, the woman would speak her Anglo-Saxon and the man would speak his Norman French. The key to any good marriage is communication, and these couples would find a way to communicate despite some truly fundamental differences. But while each member of the marriage would speak his or her own language, the children in such families would speak a mixture of the two languages. Remember, these folks were peasants, so there weren't any books, there weren't any schools, and there weren't any teachers to tell the kids how to speak or how not to speak. Therefore, there was nothing to keep the language from changing to meet the needs of the people who spoke it. Over the course of generations and centuries, Anglo-Saxon and French-Norman would continue to merge, eventually becoming a language of its own, the language that we now call Middle English. So, what did this language sound like? Well, you're going to learn your own little bit of it soon enough. But for now, let's look at that old chestnut from the third Beowulf video, the Lord's Prayer. In case you forgot, Here's what it sounds like in modern English. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. And here's what it sounds like in good old Anglo Saxon. Fader ure, thu de erton hefonum, si di name je halgud. Tobi cometh I risha, je worthy thin willa on earthen swaswa on hefonum. Uni je die walikum laf silachus to die, and for yivus jure yiltus, swaswa way for yiveth jurum yildendum. En neelea to oos aan kustungen, akalius uf uvilla, sot licher. Now excuse me while I geek out a bit. Here is the Lord's Prayer in Norman French. We're going to hear what it sounds like in a minute, but what I want some of you to notice here is that while the language on your screen is definitely French, it looks an awful lot like Latin. And that's because Norman French and any other early version of French is simply a regional dialect of Latin. French is a Romance language. You know, Romance, which has the word Roman in it. And if you trace it back far enough, you will find that its earliest speakers were actually speaking the local version of Latin. This is true not only of French, but of other Romance languages, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian. All of these languages began as regional dialects of Latin. Now, since I have absolutely no background in the history of the French language, I had to get the help of someone who does. Professor Lynn Ramey is a member of the French department at Vanderbilt, where she specializes in medieval French literature. She has generously agreed to help by laying down the Lord's Prayer in the country French of the Normans. Professor Ramey, take it away.
Li nostre Pere, qui ets et ciels, sanctifiet sed le tuns nuns. Avieniet li tuns regnes, siet faite la tue volonté, sicum en ciel et en la terre. Notre pain quotidien donne-nous et pardonne à nous les nos dettes, et comme nous pardonnons à nos détours. Et nous ne mènes en tentation, mais délivre-nous de mal. Amen.
Thank you, Professor Ramey. Now here is the Lord's Prayer in Middle English. Our Father, that art in heavenas, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come tau, be thy will done, in earth as in heaven. Uva tau us this day, our bread, and forva tau us our debtors, as we forvoin tau our debtores, and lead us not unto temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. So as I said, I'm really geeking out here, and maybe some of you are too. But the question for most of you is, who cares? Well, annoying Gary Coleman internet meme, I care. And I will tell you who else should care. You. That's who should care. Any student who is working hard to expand his or her vocabulary should care. Because if you know something about the history of the language that you speak, your attempt to master that language becomes much more meaningful. So let's take a look at the big picture. Here is a list of the 100 most frequently used words in the English language. What you will notice is that all of these words are short. Thee, I, me, go, take, you, so, what, can, time, them, way, work, from, well, and so on. Most of these words are between 2 and 5 letters in length. Many of them consist of a single syllable, and every single one of them is Anglo Saxon in origin. And if you were to look at the next 100 most frequently used words in the English language today, you would find that 83 of those are Anglo Saxon in origin as well. Now the point is this: when you speak in everyday language, when you're hanging out with your friends in the hallway, when you're talking to your mom on the telephone, when you're sharing a joke with your sister, just talking, about 90% of the words that you use are Anglo-Saxon in origin. These words are short, they're plain, and they're functional. But the language that you and I speak consists of more than just 1- and 2-syllable words, and that's where Norman French comes in. Whenever you reach for words that intend to impress, when you go before a court of law, when you write an essay for college, when you write a thank you note to your aunt, when you write a poem to the one that you love, the words that you choose are almost always from the Norman French gene pool. These words are long, they are luxurious, they are ornamental. They are the words that we look to when we want to sound sophisticated and smart. So let me illustrate by turning to a scenario, again, of romance and love. Welcome to Brit Lit 10's Date Night. Meet our lovely couple. Well, actually, they're not a couple yet, but they'd like to be. He asks her out on a date. Ask, of course, is an Anglo Saxon word. It's short, it's plain, and it's functional. She says, maybe. May I inquire where we would go? Now, inquire, which means the exact same thing as ask, is Norman French. It's long, it's luxurious, it's ornamental. Date night arrives. They sit across from each other. Candlelight, soft music, people at other tables speaking in low voices. It's all very romantic indeed. Now he is a little bit nervous, so he begins to sweat. Sweat is Anglo-Saxon. She's nervous too, but she doesn't sweat. Women, I'm told, never sweat, but she does perspire. Perspire, which means the exact same thing as sweat, is Norman French, and everyone knows that sweat stinks, but perspiration doesn't. They look at the menu. So many choices. He says, I'll have the pig. No wonder he's nervous. She says, don't you mean the pork? He says, maybe I'll have the cow. And she says, you mean the beef, right? He says, sheep, maybe? No, mutton. How about calf? No, veal. Chicken? No, silly. Poultry. This must be love. Deer? No, dear. Venison. And on throughout that enchanted evening. The point, of course, is this. Modern English, the language that you and I speak, is the richest and most expressive language in the world today. And it begins with a host of poor peasant families living in the wake of war and scratching out a meager existence in thatch huts dotted across the medieval English countryside. But if we owe those humble folks a debt of gratitude and appreciation, so too does Geoffrey Chaucer. Let me explain. If you were to go over to the Vanderbilt Library and look at their largest Russian dictionary and count all of the words in it, you'd find that there is about 150,000 words in the Russian language. Now, this on its own doesn't mean very much. In fact, it sounds like an awful lot of words. So in order for this number to be meaningful, we need to compare Russian to another language. So let's look at French. If you were French, the largest dictionary in your library would hold about 180,000 words. That's 20% more than the Russian dictionary, which is a pretty big jump. But if you were to go to the latest edition of the largest English dictionary, the Oxford English Dictionary, you would find that English has over 616,000 words in it. English has more ways to say the same thing than any other language on the planet. So when we acknowledge the literary genius of Chaucer, we must keep in mind that he was an immensely skilled and educated person, but that he's also writing at exactly the time that the language is exploding in size. That doesn't mean that he uses more words, but rather that he has more words to choose from than anyone who came before him. Simply put, Chaucer was writing in the largest and most vibrant language in the medieval world. That concludes this Brit Lit 10 video podcast on the language of the Canterbury Tales. In our next podcast, we'll cover the first 18 lines of the general prologue in Middle English. See you then.